Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning for those of you on the west coast of the United States, and have a good late night for those of you in East Asia. We're back on Facebook Live. God willing, Torah Box pre-recorded videos will also go up soon. We've taken a little break with recording those, but we have a nice library that if you haven't seen it, the link will be at the end of this video. You should go check those out. And this week is Parashath Ki Theitzei. There are 3 weeks left in the year. There are actually 3 Shabbatot left in this year. Ki Theitzei, Ki Tavo, Nitzavim. Nitzavim is always the last parasha of the year. Sometimes it's joined with Vayelech, but whether it's joined with Vayelech or not, it's always the last Shabbat of the year. So we have to get ready for the end of the year, and getting ready for the end of the year brings up Slichos. Slichot, what is it? Where did it come from? What are its laws? The sages instituted prayers and their times to correspond with the sacrificial services as they were conducted in the temple. And that is why we have seen previously, for example, that the morning prayers should correspond to the morning sacrifice, and the time for the morning prayers corresponds to the proper time for the morning sacrifice. They started the morning sacrifice in the temple around sunrise, and it would continue for quite some time then. In emergency situations or extenuating circumstances, they would wait even as late as perhaps 4 hours into the day, or even until noon technically, and that is why, for example, you can continue your prayers on a regular morning. Even if you missed your sunrise prayers, you still have quite a few hours to do it. And the same is true with regards to the afternoon service. And because there was no night sacrifice, what they would offer at night was basically all the extra parts of the sacrifices of that day that had not been burned. If there's only 2 sacrifices in a day, there usually wasn't this nighttime shift. But on busy days, the most important thing to put onto the altar first is the blood and the fats from the animals, and the rest of it, if there was too much of a crush, there was too many animals being offered, the limbs would have to wait until the night shift when there were a few Kohanim on duty, whose job was to burn all that was left over before its time expired. Now, that is why we, for example, have the line of the Gemara which says that there is no specific time. There's no keva for arvit. There's no exact time. Maimonides famously said that we don't really look into this matter that much. Inan midaktikim. We don't really, I wouldn't say care, but this isn't something for which there's much. The word would be hakpada in Hebrew. It's a very difficult word to translate into English. There is not so much concern for the proper time of Arvit because it doesn't necessarily correspond to anything that was done in the temple. Now, Slichot doesn't really correspond to anything that did in temple times. We looked at Musaf. There are some days there's Musaf, and therefore the time for our Musaf prayer, which corresponds to that additional Korban, is sometime later in the morning, around the middle of the day. But in temple times, they did not have Slichot. We have, for example, an extra service that was instituted on fast days. Most people only recognize it now from the greatest fast day, Yom Kippur, but this used to be a feature on all public fast days, which also were an emergency measure. A service called Ne'ilah, which means the closing of the gates, Ne'ilat Sha'arim. And they say is that correspond to the closing of the heavenly gates on the day of prayer, or does it correspond to the closing of the gates of the temple? If we're using this model that all the other services and their times correspond to what was done in the temple, then this corresponds to what was the closing of the gates of the temple, signifying the end of the work day, so to speak, or the service day would be a more accurate translation. Ne'ilah itself does not necessarily correspond to any sacrifice that was in the temple, but at least it corresponds to something that the Kohanim did. Slichot is something that is not mentioned in the Talmud. It is something that comes from the time of the Gonim. And if we look, for example, in the Mishnah Torah, which is always a good place to look for all basic Talmudic law, Maimonides first mentions there that there's slichot. What was slichot to him? Slichot was something that they did the days between Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. They would wake up in Ashmoret. When is Ashmoret? Ashmoret is the watch. The night could not be divided into hours because our calendars were based on the fact that they used to use a solar clock. They had sundials. They divided the day into 12 hours, and this ability to divide the day into 12 hours was on the assumption that there's sun shining, so you know how to divide up the day. But at night, there was no concept of hours because there is no sunlight by definition. Instead, they were able to divide up the night roughly into 3 watches. And indeed, that's also how they did in the temple. There was an honor guard all night long composed of Kohanim and Leviim, and they were on duty and they divided themselves up into those 3 watches. So in the Rambam's terminology, that's Maimonides, in his terminology, the practice was to wake up extra early. Now, most people used to wake up at dawn or around then. And that's a halachic ideal, and people have pointed out that you can be much more productive and also healthy if you train yourself to go to sleep when it's dark and wake up sometime before the sun rises. What he is describing here is a practice to wake up extra early. Instead of just waking up for your sunrise prayers, you get yourself up, half an hour beforehand so that you can have extra time for these additional supplications. And that's what the practice was. Notice how it was strictly limited to the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which he says are days that are apt for repentance. That's where we get our terminology also, the 10 days of repentance, which start with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But he does not mention, for example, the practice that is generally considered the Ashkenazic practice to start slichot, let's say, 4 days or even as much as 7 days before Rosh Hashanah, or the generally Sephardic practice to start a whole month before Rosh Hashanah. There is very little for us to base our practice on, therefore. When should slichot be said? So if you follow this idea that the point is to have extra supplications, we can understand, for example, why Maimonides says they would wake up extra early as opposed to we just have a service for Shacharit, or we have a service after the morning service, or Mincha time. There is no sacrifice. By sacrifice, I don't mean an animal sacrifice in the temple. I mean there's no giving of oneself when one just stays up a little bit later or stays at Shacharit a little bit longer to pray. Yes, we sometimes do that. We have an additional service to attend, but there is no self-sacrifice involved in praying a little bit longer. Or staying up a little bit later. Most people can do that. There's a lot more to waking up extra early and offering one's prayers than there is to, let's say, staying up a little bit later up at night. Most people actually do that, and that's actually something they do for enjoyment. There are very few people who, for the sake of enjoyment, especially physical pleasures, get up extra early in the morning. That is why, also now, there is, I could not honestly say, and I'm surprised if people do say this, that there is actually any strict halachic parameters for when the slichot should be said. And however, there are Kabbalistic ideas, which are much later, where they describe how the last part of the night is better. That is, after midnight, that's the ideal time for slichot. And the first part of the night is somehow not the right time. There are people who take this Kabbalistic idea so seriously they even consider it prohibition. They do think it's the worst thing in the world. But as many of us know, we don't hold that way, although there are some people who are quite surprised when we do tell them that. And by the way, the Kabbalistic idea that the ideal time is the last half of the night precludes what is a general practice, let's say in New York, like I used to do in YU's high school, and like a lot of other synagogues do. They don't necessarily hold their morning services every day at sunrise. They just say, during the times of slichot, we're just going to tell you, show up 15 minutes or half an hour earlier, we're going to do slichot beforehand. So you still have to wake up early, but you're not necessarily fulfilling this Kabbalistic dictum because you are saying slichot basically when it's already morning. Even local synagogues here, they basically daven 20 minutes after sunrise. So their slichot is around sunrise. That's still a little bit too late for this to satisfy this Kabbalistic concern. Like I said, I wouldn't push it down on people too much because we are dealing with something that has no Talmudic basis. Now, if you open up your slichot, you're probably familiar with the old-fashioned ones where you had to keep flipping the pages back to the first day. The Sephardic practice, or the generally Sephardic practice, says the same basic liturgy every single day. Because slichot are so recent, they have taken so many different forms across the Jewish world. Because, for example, the daily prayers were ordained by the sages, even if you're using a radically different siddur, let's say you're using a Yemenite siddur, you could still recognize it. It is the same Kriyat Shema with its brachot before the Shemona Esrei and Shacharit, and it's basically the same Shemona Esrei. It only has very few minor differences. Yes, we pick up on these things because we say them every day. So if I were to hand you, you've only used an Ashkenazic siddur, and I handed you an Eidoda Mizrach siddur, you would actually notice, oh yeah, Yatzmach, Porkaneh, and other words here and there. But the general form of the prayer is the same. It's just evolved separately in different places. Slichot is not like that. There were no slichot ordained by the sages, which is why the general Ashkenazic practice is so radically different from the Eidoda Mizrach practice. They're almost unrecognizable. What they do have in common is that they have piyutim, poems, and they also have the recitations of the Shlosh Esrei Midot. As I've written in a recent article available online at the website, it is odd that one or two particular opinions about how to enumerate these 13 attributes have been basically made their way into the Siddur, even though they were certainly not agreed upon by the majority of the commentaries. It's actually quite difficult. You can go look at that. There's a chart there that was published originally in the Korean, in the Steinsaltz version of the Talmud, the tractate Rosh Hashanah. You go see that there is very little consensus with regard to what they are, but that is a central feature: piyutim and the recitation of the Shlosh Esrei Midot. And one thing that actually picked up also with slichot is the fact that there's a minyan. For example, Rambam mentions nothing about a minyan, 10 men getting together for slichot. If you can read what he says, it apparently maybe it was even done by individuals or groups of individuals, but it's not something that needs a minyan. However, something that has been picked up is that we introduce the slichot with saying Ashrei and Kaddish, just like we would before a Musaf or Mincha. And there's a Kaddish Tit Kabal at the end of the service because it's almost like a whole service. That is also relatively new in Jewish history. But everything between the Ashrei and the Kaddish and then the final Kaddish is basically so new that you cannot find correspondence between the Ashkenazic practice and the Sephardic practice. Sephardic practice is basically the same piyutim every day, and at certain points they just say the 13 attributes. If you're familiar with the Sephardic version, you'll see that on Yom Kippur, these are the same piyutim, the same slichot they say after every service. This is the same one that follows the Arvit and the Shacharit and the Musaf and the Mincha and the Ne'ilah, except they have a different Kabbalistic practice for each one, how many times to say the Shlosh Esrei Midot in the middle of these piyutim. I don't remember the mnemonic before, but sometimes they say it 7 times, sometimes it's 4 times, sometimes it's 5 times. The Ashkenazic practice is totally different, as we mentioned. There they have specific windows in Art Scroll's words. There's the introductory part of the prayer, and then there's the Shlosh Esrei Midot, and then there's another, a secondary prayer, another chance to say the Shlosh Esrei Midot. And then for every single day of Slichot, there's a specific batch of piyutim, which are very esoteric and very hard to understand, and also very hard to say because you only say them once a year, if any. And then the Shlosh Esrei Midot are said between them. Eventually there's Tachanun and a Vidui, and then the Slichot are over. It's interesting, why I say some are only said, not even said every year. There's 3 days worth of Slichot to be said before Rosh Hashanah, and then there's a special service that is the day before Rosh Hashanah. And if there's more days before Rosh Hashanah, so they add 2 days of that. There's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday already is the day before Rosh Hashanah. And then if Rosh Hashanah is going to be a Monday or a Tuesday in the next week, they add even more days before you get to the final service before Rosh Hashanah. In years where Rosh Hashanah is Tuesday, that means there's a special, unique Slichot service for the first week before Rosh Hashanah, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Plus that Sunday, again, before Rosh Hashanah, you say a batch of slichot that is only said mathematically, on average, it's only said once every 7 years, that batch of slichot, and then on Monday, which is Erev Rosh Hashanah, you say the usual Erev Rosh Hashanah piyutim that are said every single year. So these special Sundays, that's the most unique one. Those are the most unfamiliar because, well, people aren't saying them. There's some people who are alive today who might be completely unfamiliar with it. It's already been a decade since Rosh Hashanah was last on a Shabbat. It has been 12 years by my reckoning. 12 years. No, it's been 11 years. 11 years since the last time that we said this special batch of slichot. It was back in the 2008 when they were last said, and also I think it's going to be like another 2 or 3 years before they're said again. So there are people who might not even be familiar with that. This once again shows that the slichot is something very, very new. The fact that the Ashkenazic and Sephardic practices are so radically different. But most importantly, now let's get to what's the point. The point is that someone takes time to actually pray something differently. I think it's good, in a certain sense, that the prayers be unique and unfamiliar, so that if someone has the time, he could actually pray without being on autopilot. The problem with, let's say, the same prayers every single day is that there's a certain regularity to it. It becomes habit. It becomes habitual and fall into autopilot. He doesn't even think about what he's saying. But if the liturgy is new to him, so now we'll actually have to go a little bit slower. We'll actually have to think about it. The problem is that, and I've seen this before, is that the slichot service is actually, it's so difficult to understand. It uses Hebrew words that you cannot find anywhere else, and it uses poetic. It's vague, and it's very hard to understand what it's trying to say because it uses these poetic terms. It is not something for a lightweight. And what happened in recent decades, is that this liturgy is similar to the liturgy of the keynote of Tisha B'Av. And I'm hoping there won't be another Tisha B'Av again, but in years past, in order to make this a little bit easier, so there's been groups on Tisha B'Av, they sit down, they say the keynote, they say it together, there's someone explaining what is going on. He analyzes the words, he explains to the Kila what is. And that should be done with the Slichot. The problem is that it's not happening. The problem is that we just run through it. People have been given 20 minutes for Slichot, and let's say it's Friday, the Friday before the Rosh Hashanah, which is going to be on Monday. So these are Slichot that aren't said every single year. They're said, most years, but not every single year. And now people see these Slichot. They don't have time to even consider it. They don't have time to study it. There's the rabbi is not sitting down with everybody and telling what it is. That, I believe, is something that we could rectify. If people have time, they should get to shul extra early and have time to say, this is the special prayers that are unique for today. And of course, the Ashkenazic practice also has every day of the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is also a unique batch of piyutim. And it's worth it also. Take some time and actually know what you're saying. Person should take some time and actually consider what have I done differently this year? What could I have done differently? What should I have done differently? What did I do this year? What do I have to rectify? What do I have to fix? Or maybe, perhaps, what do I have to think about even? Sometimes we don't even know what to fix because we don't have time to even think about it. The slichot, if I could, I would actually offer this every morning when we start slichot, an explanation generally before we do it, or actually explanations during the slichot. That would actually make it take longer. I don't know if anybody is prepared for such a thing. I've never seen such a thing, but I do believe that is something that is necessary. Or, as I've heard people advocate before, what we should instead have is perhaps just use the Sephardic rite, because those piyutim are much easier to understand and they're much more melodic. There's tunes that everybody knows. They're easier for people to sing in groups. Similar to a lot of the other synagogue functions we have. Most people, they go into their synagogue, which they're familiar with, on a Shabbat for example, you know what Kabbalat Shabbat is. You can sing it, and if you've been doing it a lot of times, you've actually maybe begun to think about the words, and you know what's going on. You know what to expect. You know how to You know how to have the proper kavanah, the proper thoughts and intentions when saying it. And the same thing also Shabbat morning. You know what's going to be sung. You're familiar with the liturgy. That's the advantage of the Sephardic Slichot. Oh, I remember now. Rabbi Barchim said this a few years ago, so now I'll plug him also. He said that. Let's give something a little bit about this week's parasha. There is now an argument in the American side of the world about people who are advocating for a loosening of biblical restrictions, or at least trying to find some sort of rabbinic way. There's a rabbinic will, there's a rabbinic way to permit that which the Torah has explicitly forbidden, that which the sages say. And of course, these are societal problems. I think that there's something deeply wrong with this way of thinking. Thank God here where I live, these things don't exist. I mean, I'm sure there are people who do have a little bit different tendencies with regards to their physical desires, but that there's no main social push to have greater acceptance of these matters within the community. That doesn't exist. This week's parasha is actually a more nuanced message than, let's say, a parasha we read a few months ago, back in the spring, Harimot and Kedoshim. We read them separately this year. It was a leap year. In Harimot Kedoshim, in both of them, we have a list of the forbidden relations. It says a man, your typical Jewish man, is not to have a relationship with certain relatives, and there's a long list there. And that list also is very simple. I've written myself some notes for these things. It basically outlaws the close relationships, the family members, adultery, bestiality, homosexuality, and of course, nida, the menstruant woman. That's basic. These are basic laws that a person can understand. There's a biblical taboo against these things. Now, a person couldn't go and say, okay, fine, find an eligible woman who I'm not related to. Those are proper marriage partners. That's all that the Torah has to say about these matters. But now we get into this week's parsha, and this week's parsha is a lot more of adult level. Assuming that relationships are proper, a person's looking for, like I said, single women who are not related to him. We now have the issue of, for example, the Yafat Toar, which involves basically a marriage which is coerced. A woman who's sort of forced into being in the relationship against her will. A man who is considered also coerced by his evil inclination. He's forced onto the battlefield. People who are soldiers who go through the trauma and the exaltation of victory. So sometimes their Yetzer Haras are stronger. The Torah, the Chazal said, sages said, that the Torah here is talking to those who are overcome by their inclinations. We have the case of, it's difficult, we have the case of rape, chas v'shalom, or what is actually, as I pointed out in an article, was considered also coercive act, but not necessarily rape. We have seduction. We have the prohibition against cross-dressing. We have the prohibition against divorce. A man who accuses a wife of not being as chaste as her parents claimed she was before the wedding. These are all much more complicated issues, societal issues. There's also the case of divorce and remarriage. Not every marriage, even though people were once upon a time married, and they stopped being married for a while. She was married to someone else in the meantime, and then divorced again. She cannot return to her usual husband. Levirate marriage. A woman who dies without woman whose husband dies without children should be marrying her brother-in-law. Transactional relationships. We have the concept of kadesh and kedisha. Those are considered, pointed out that perhaps someone would say that as long as these two people are eligible to be married, and there's, for example, a Jewish wedding is transactional. A man gives the woman a ring, which is supposed to be, a man gives a woman a ring, which is supposed to be of value, and that's what affects the marriage. Maimonides points out that people used to think that, for example, prostitution, as long as it's willing and it involves a also a transactional nature, so that could be okay. Or a man can decide that he's going to decide what to do with his daughter also because that's his right. That's not right. Or indulgences. What's an indulgence? That's the idea that someone has done something wrong and he's now going to bring an offering to the temple in order to make up for that. They said a woman who works as a harlot should not be bringing her proceeds to the temple. These are just a few examples, but they go on a little bit more. My point is that there were those who wanted to say that the nature of this code, what he calls the Deuteronomic code, is so different from the Levitic code. It shows that they had different authors, and and perhaps here that which was prohibited in Leviticus in Achrei Kedoshim is not necessarily prohibited in this book. I think that's a terrible thing to say. He sort of missed the point. In Achrei Kedoshim, we're giving just the basics. And now, before Moshe Rabbeinu died, he was telling them it's a lot more complicated than that. Just because you have a relationship between a man and a woman, by the way, cross-dressing is also prohibited in this week's Parsha. Just because you have a proper heterosexual relationship, it does not mean that you're off scot-free. You still have